And then there was an elderly Sikh gentleman who told me something, and I thought the penny dropped for me. And he said in Punjabi, which I will then sort of translate into English, he said, "Puttar, kise de haath saaf nahi. Nobody's hands are clean."
Today we are here with award-winning and best-selling writer of 8 books, Manreet Sodhi Someshwar. She has most recently been working on the Partition Trilogy, of which 2 books have come out. I find Manreet to be an absolutely spellbinding writer, and I've said this before, that the way in which you weave narratives, you create personalities, you build dialogues, and even enliven geographies. Locations play a very important role in your book. But to sort of, extend the last question, there is, of course, fiction, but fiction based on the past, and there are different approaches to how writers deal with this arena. There are people who might completely rely on imagination when it is about weaving a narrative, even if it is historically based. But there is also an approach which you use, critical fabulation. So could you shed some light on that?
Yeah, wonderful. So when I started working on what is now the Partition Trilogy, and as Eric said, books 1 and 2 have released, which is Lahore and Hyderabad, and inshallah Kashmir comes out this year. What my plan with that was to, one, put into the narrative stories that I had grown up with, stories which I did not find in my history textbooks. And also at the same time, what I wanted to do was put in the same narrative our political leaders, especially the ones who were in Delhi at the time of 1947 and the run up to it, and see how the decisions made in Delhi are impacting those for whom the decisions are being made. For instance, Lahore is set in the 9 months leading up to independence and partition. So it's the decisions being taken in Delhi by Jawaharlal Nehru, who is the interim Prime Minister, Vallabhbhai Patel, who is the Deputy Prime Minister and the Home Minister, and Dicky Mountbatten, or Lord Mountbatten, who is the last Viceroy in India. So it is these men who are tussling with and negotiating to figure out what the final shape of the subcontinent will be once the British depart. And I'm starting with Lahore because I grew up in Punjab personally myself, and I think the partition's axe really fell on Punjab as a state. And therefore so as the historians would say, it is putting the subaltern and the elite on the same stage, and that's what I'm trying to do. So when you embark on a project like that, especially in today's day and age where history is being weaponized, I have to be careful that all the resources, all the sources that I cite for both are things that can be verified. And when I have been researching this trilogy for 20 years, so when I was still trying to figure out how best to sort of do this match of imaginative creative fiction with what is really narrative non-fiction but creatively told, I was in New York City and I came across this professor called Saidiya Hartman, who was teaching at that time in the college where I was taking a course in trauma literature to sort of deepen my own understanding of trauma. And Saidiya Hartman teaches has in fact come up with this concept called creative fabulation, critical fabulation. What she really does is that on a scaffolding of hard research, you do a padding of creative fiction. So the skeleton is entirely borne by hard facts, by sources that can be referenced and cited. But on top of it, you add a padding of imagination, of trying to bring those characters alive. And I think that was really helpful for me because that's what I have attempted with the 3 books in the Partition Trilogy.
So you mentioned about the past now recently being weaponized, or the sort of historical writing being weaponized. I think another thing is that in the context of partition especially, even though it's a major turning point in history, I think, and you've talked about this before, that you keep reminding people that there was also a partition. So I want you to talk a bit about the context in which you're writing. When you're seeing the past being weaponized, when you're seeing the way in which we remember this major turning point in our past is sometimes being forgotten, how is it to be writing about the partition in these times?
Thank you, Eric. That's a wonderful question. I think when we look at the 75th year of India's independence, which is what we are marking or celebrating now, we have given short shrift to the fact that it is also the 75th year of India's partition. In fact, partition was the cost for independence. There wouldn't be one without the other. They go together. They're concomitant. And I guess because I'm a Punjabi, because I come from a particular border town, and where I was, in fact, yesterday I traveled from my hometown of Firozpur to Jaipur, and it took a whole day. I tell people I could fly into Lahore and then into Amritsar, it would be easier, you know. So we have to recognize that while we celebrate India's independence, and rightly so, we also have to find a way of dealing with partition and its trauma, which lingers to this day. And I have always been aware of it, and that's why I said my writing career started with that thought. And to provide further context, I live in New York City, which is sort of the home, the capital of the Jewish diaspora, right? People who fled the Nazi Holocaust. And for a lot of these people, wrestling with that event, which has sort of the same age as India's partition, is an ongoing affair. We have the third generation which is still writing wonderful fiction, non-fiction, memoir, and wrestling with the demons of Holocaust. And every year, you know, one or two books are winning awards, which is necessary because awards bring attention to books. Now, when I contrast it with what we have done with partition, for instance, I think we have mostly paid lip service. You know, there will be a WhatsApp which will come from somebody in Lahore, and people will tut-tut and shed a few tears. But the fact is that partition doesn't want us to be sentimental. It wants us to interrogate the past. It wants us to ask why it happened. And since I brought the parallel of the Holocaust, the Jewish Holocaust and partition, you know, very often academics and people who are studying these tend to compare the two.
Yeah.
But I think the comparison gives is short shrift to partition for the simple reason, and here I'll cite when I had started my oral narrative and, you know, collecting the oral narratives of people who were elderly, a lot of whom have passed away, but who actually witnessed partition, certainly from my hometown. There was initially a lot of resistance. People didn't want to talk about it. But at some point in time, there was, you know, people started to speak. I was gathering some narratives. And then there was an elderly Sikh gentleman who told me something, and I thought the penny dropped for me. And he said in Punjabi, which I will then you know, sort of translate into English, he said, Puttar kise de haath saaf nahi. Nobody's hands are clean. And to elaborate on this, in the Jewish Holocaust, there are very clear villains and heroes or survivors. The Nazis are the villains. But in the case of India's partition, certainly in Punjab there was no ghetto, or no Muslim ghetto, or this is a Hindu colony, or this is where the Sikhs live. Everybody lived cheek by jowl. So when partition happened, brother literally turned against brother. And violence was committed by Sikh households, by Hindu households, by Muslim households. And that is why the guilt is so strong. How does, for instance, my grandfather talk about it, or my grand uncle talk about it? Because violence was both committed within the homes. You know, there are numerous accounts of men of the house fearing that the women will be violated, lining up the women, and I'm saying women loosely as a gender term. This could be somebody from the age of 80 all the way to an 8-month-old baby, and shooting them. So there's violence within the house, and then there's violence which is being committed on women of other houses. And I think that's why partition particularly is so traumatic and so difficult to wrestle with, because we have to look in the mirror and ask ourselves this question.
Absolutely, and I think it's so important that you talk about interrogating and asking the past questions, because a lot of times in our conversations on history, be it any historical event, I think sometimes we just want to remember the past and maybe create a distance. It's happened, now what? But certain events just do not leave you internally. They are asking you to remember, but not only to remember, but to ask. And I think that's very important, that it's not only about thinking about it, but thinking why you're thinking about it, why is it still relevant? And I guess that is why conversations, books, or a theme, no matter how repetitive it might get, is extremely significant. So thank you for shedding light on that. Now, of course, you've talked about your approach. And I've said this before, that as a student of history, my first instinct, be it any book, is to turn to the last few pages and is to look at the bibliography, the works cited section. Now, you've done rigorous research for your work on the Partition series. I want you to talk a bit about that. How was it to go through the archives, the documents that you referred to, and the sort of primary and secondary documents that you use as your sources?
Yeah, thanks, Eric. So as far as I can remember, as I said, my journey really as a writer began with trying to understand my hometown, trying to understand the narratives that were there, which I did not find in my history textbooks, as I said. Unfortunately, the way history is taught in India, certainly it was when I was growing up, it was dates, this happened, and partition is never really dealt with. And I was very aware, even as a small child, that I would, you're sort of playing a game of hide and seek, and you stumble into a room which is full of women, and the conversation immediately comes to a stop. It just peters off. And as a child, you don't pay heed to it. But once I had moved out of my hometown and I started connecting the dots, the women were talking about the violence that had been committed, that nobody was talking about. In my own neighborhood, in our colony, the house behind ours, there was a woman who was called the mad woman, the pagal hai ji. And I remember her as a child. We were told, you do not approach her, you stay away from her. She was not violent, from what I remember. She just used to sit in the courtyard in the sun, her hair all askew, and it had been cut very short because I guess she used to tear her hair out. She would just be mumbling. She would be speaking all the time. At times there would be volleys of words coming out. At times she would be very quiet and she would be sobbing. This was classified as a mad woman. And again, once I started interrogating the past, what had I seen? I realized she was one of those victims or survivors. Clearly her family thought she was a victim, and she had been abducted and then was saved, rescued and brought back, but she wasn't rehabilitated. She was never accepted as part of society. In fact, her own family kept her because they were shamed into it by the women's organizations which were leading the effort to rescue these women. And I think that all of that is something I grew up with. But it's only when I read Khushwant Singh's Train to Pakistan, which I came to very late in life. I was in my early 20s, and then it struck me, gosh, this is what I have seen. This is history. This is what really happened. And I feel that it's a false narrative when we privilege non-fiction and say, oh, this tells the truth. Yeah. Truth is not the safekeeping of any one kind of narrative. Truth is derived from a lot of sources. It requires a deep engagement with the past, with what has happened, with what really was undergone. For instance, when partition happened and so many women had been violated when they crossed the border, and there is this wonderful text, because it is really a collection of people's testimonies. It's called Stern Reckoning by G.D. Khosla, who was a High Court judge. And women say that I was badly used. I'm translating this in English. But the people who are recording it are male, they are clerks, and they are recording it as, oh, so this woman, had injury, she suffered. But what the woman is really saying is that she was sexually violated, she was raped, but we don't have a record of that. So there are so many missteps happening, There is this woman who's telling what happened to her, but there is on the other side, she has been violated by a male, but there is this male who won't even record that. So who is listening to her stories? Who is talking about, where is the truth getting lost in this? Therefore, when I, as I said, it has been a 20-year engagement. My first novel is The Long Walk Home, which again looks at the turbulent 20th century history of Punjab through the life of a family. Later, I wrote The Radiance of a Thousand Suns, which is really my attempt to look at 47 and see how it repeated, copy-paste in 84. And that narrative is entirely through the voices of women, because what I'm trying to do is rescue women from history, which in India certainly is his story, Rescue women from those interstices of history and let them speak. Give them agency and put them front and center. And to do that, there are two kinds of sort of research I have done. One is really, as I said, oral narratives, because we do not have enough of those available. And unfortunately, that generation is mostly gone away or are really at a stage where their memories are flawed. They have the most vivid accounts are remembered, but every remembering also changes the memory, right? So which is why I enrolled in school to study trauma, to understand how trauma is processed by the body, how trauma is remembered, and how it is sort of relayed to others. So one is that. So a lot of the female characters, even the male characters in my novels, which are fictional, are really composites. These are women who either I met or women whose stories I learned, and to make it an even more sort of powerful narrative, they're composite characters, but they're living, they were alive, they have lived through these times. And the other is really going, trawling through the labyrinth of libraries, looking for material. My research, I was at Hong Kong at that time, my research has always taken me to the Hong Kong Public Library and then the New York Public Library, which is a wonderful, wonderful resource. And I am a library fellow, which means I get to spend time, request for certain reference material. And as you said, the bibliography at the end of my books is a select bibliography, because it is impossible for me to list out all the material that I have sort of had time to troll through. Let me just leave with one thought. My writing career and my journey as a mother sort of began at the same time. And my daughter, when she was 9 years old, and I was thick into researching Vallabhbhai Patel and Jawaharlal Nehru, because I write them as my protagonists, which means when I write about Jawaharlal Nehru, Vallabhbhai Patel, and Dickie Mountbatten in the Partition Trilogy, they are not the hallowed leaders. I write as Jawahar, I write as Vallabh, I write as Dickie. And therefore, I have to know them intimately. I have to know when he got up in the morning, what did Jawahar do first thing in the morning? He did yoga, he did a headstand. What did he smoke? Did he drink? Vallabhbhai, what did he like to eat? What was his relationship with his daughter Maniben, who has always been sort of this name that we see in the backdrop, but who's never talked about? Vallabhbhai loved tea, and Maniben had to really ration his tea because his liver was inflamed and it used to cause him pain. So I had to be really intimate with these people. And as I said, it's not easy to get this information. So, I would spend time whenever I collect, these were like little gems I was collecting and sort of collating in my book. And I heard my daughter once telling her her playmate, oh, my mother spends a lot of time with dead men. They are her best friends. and that has really been my life. So I feel to write historical fiction, certainly the kind of fiction that Saidiya Hartman talks about, I have lived in those times, and I feel I want my readers, when they read the narratives, to go and also feel that they are living in those times. I literally want to catch them by the neck and say, come, run with me, because this is a time of extreme frenzy, and we are galloping along with these people. So see how it's unfolding.
Just to highlight something that you said, that it is the way in which the past is taught. A lot of times it's about truth finding, but one has to really understand that with its many layers, and what you bring out through your stories, where you're so intimate with these characters and history, is that it's never about actually finding the truth, but finding that everybody has a story, everybody has a version. And the fact that these are not numbers, these are people, these are not archives but stories, is what's very important. And you do that constantly through your historical fiction, which brings me to considering the fact that you've been doing rigorous research in this field, and a lot of times with scholars, writers, one thing does lead to another. So is there any other arena of the past that has piqued your curiosity and that you want to personalize through fictional writing?
I have so many ideas, Eric. I don't know where to begin. I think I'm hoping that with the Partition Trilogy, I am I can't say I'm done with Partition. I don't think anybody can ever be done with Partition, but I feel as I said, I was in my hometown, Firozpur, yesterday, and I spent 3 days with my mother. And the Satluj River sort of is really the boundary line between India and Pakistan. It's a river. Punjab is a riverine state. And what I want to do once Kashmir is out, I want to take all the 3 books, and I want to go to the border, which we do on every visit. And I want to tell sort of my land, my town, my soil, that I think, I'll say this in Punjabi, ki mitti da karz ada ho gaya, that I have paid my dues to the land, and you have to let me go, you have to free me. Because there is so much, whilst researching, Partition, there's so many other narratives that have come through which I want to talk about, and I really don't know whether I want to do them strictly as historical fiction, because in today's day and time, writing historical fiction with the kind of scrutiny that is required, with the kind of scrutiny that is put on the writers, it is a heavy burden. I want to free myself. So I feel I want to try other ways of writing, maybe fantasy, because fantasy speaks as well, it speaks the truth. There are a lot of narratives, certainly from Punjab, which are about, the lead up to 47. We know about 1947 in very headline terms, but I do feel that narratives which deal with, for instance, even Bhagat Singh's life, or Udham Singh, or the Ghadar movement, or the fact that there were Punjabis already testing the white man's claim in Canada, in California. We don't have narratives around that. And going back even further, I'm very interested in, the period around 1857, sort of 18th century, 1890s, that period. I'm even interested in the Vijayanagar Empire, which I believe maybe Rushdie has beaten me to it because his new novel deals with that. But there are so many ways of telling the narratives. But yes, Indian history has me hooked.
Oh, fascinating. And just before we close this conversation, you mentioned fantasy. But what about non-fiction?
I love non-fiction, and I think well-written non-fiction is hugely entertaining. I mean, one of the founders of this festival, William Dalrymple, does an exceedingly good job of that. I'm a huge fan. I do not know if I really want to get into that field, primarily because I feel that fiction allows me to bring those characters to life in a way that even the best of non-fiction puts certain constraints. I think we have, even when you look at the book market, it's skewed towards non-fiction. I think we need more fiction which explores the possibilities of love in strife, which explore the possibilities of grayness, the ideas that the truth is not one. Each of us is seeking our own truth, and we can sort of parlay with that truth. It doesn't have to be us against them. We are all of us in this together. I just want to sort of leave with one thought, which is, there is, because I grew up in the border town, as I said, my father is of the generation where he wrote in Urdu and English. He spoke Punjabi, of course, but it was not taught at schools. So for us, listening to ghazals and sher-o-shairi was a given. It was part of the sort of the cultural milieu of not just a house, a hometown, and Punjab itself. So, there is this wonderful ghazal which Jagjit Singh sang, and which became very popular in the 80s and 90s, which goes like, Sadma to hai mujhe bhi, कि तुझसे जुदा हूँ मैं, लेकिन ये पूछता हूँ कि अब तेरा क्या हूँ मैं. So for those who probably do not grasp Hindustani entirely, the poet is saying that I am heartbroken that we have sort of separated, but now that we have separated, I want to know what really exists amongst us or between us. And then in the very next share, the poet answers his own question. He says, क्या जाने किस अदा से लिया तूने मेरा नाम, क्या जाने किस अदा से लिया तूने मेरा नाम, दुनिया समझ रही है कि सब कुछ तेरा हूँ मैं. What he says, but you still remember me in a certain fashion, that it makes the world feel as if you and I are the only ones in this story. And I want to leave this thought because certainly the Punjab that I come from, the West Punjab and the East Punjab, that is the relationship that is shared. And I think that is certainly the relationship that exists to this day between India and Pakistan. just because we drew a line on the soil, the millennia old or maybe 2 millennia old soil, the cultural soil doesn't change. So that still binds us. You know.
Fascinating. And as a student of history, thank you, Manreet, because what you do is you bring the name to the numbers, you bring a story to the archives. And I think those are the tales that hit you when you begin to understand that behind these documents and these range of stories that you might just hear about, ye hua tha, wo hua tha, there are these people who process the way we do, who have gone through this very traumatic phase that still continues to affect us. So thank you for bringing the story to life. Thank you so much, and thank you to everybody for joining, and thank you to everybody for watching this episode.
If you've enjoyed this podcast, subscribe to our channel now. We have a new episode out every Friday.